Well, a long time ago, when I first studied philosophy, I was greatly influenced by this book quoted at the top of the screen, Philosophical Investigations by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And this quote, "A picture held us captive and we could not get outside of it." We are often held captive by pictures that we hold in our mind that are misleading or even affirmatively incorrect, but at least very, very misleading. These metaphors can capture our thinking and box it in ways that can be very damaging. And I want to talk about the one that I think that boxes us in, especially in political philosophy, and that is the metaphor of the line. And that's such a destructive metaphor. Now, that's the line where there's one extreme at the end of the line and another extreme at the other end of the line, and there's a sweet spot in the middle, the happy moderate, such a happy word, moderate. Moderate. I'm not an extremist. I'm moderate. It's the picture of the line with the sweet spot in the middle. Now, sometimes, of course, that's a very good picture to have. Coffee can be way too hot and you can burn your mouth drinking it, or it can be way too cold and it tastes awful. Yee. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And of course, who could argue with what the historical Buddha Shakyamuni preached when he talked about the middle way? On the one hand, there's extreme asceticism, people who went off in the woods and starved themselves to death. And then there's ridiculous overindulgence in every physical carnal desire. The middle way is better. Who can argue with that? Though I would point out in both cases, the middle way, that's the sweet spot, may not be in the exact middle. I don't think a lukewarm cup of coffee is the best. I think a pretty darn hot but not quite burning hot is the best. And on the extremes between asceticism and ridiculous overindulgence, I think most of us lean towards being a little bit more on the restraint side of the picture. So it's not necessarily the exact middle that's the sweet spot, but the big problem is the line. We got to get away from that. Most things don't work that way. This one-dimensional figure, in geometry, the line is one dimension, length. Get away from the one dimension with extremes on either end and get towards something else, a three-dimensional world. In politics, and that's where we're going, in politics, the metaphor of the line is extremely dangerous, misleading, and confusing, because then we get the left and the right. Now, if we're going to think in the terms of the line, I would readily be characterized as way over there on that far left side. Some people say you can't get further left than that guy. But I don't think that's a meaningful statement. I don't think that's the right metaphor. I'm not even sure metaphors will help us here. One thing I want you to notice is that if you think the left is the extreme and the right is the extreme, then there's going to be a sweet spot in the middle, and the moderate. That's the reasonable one. Before you accept that way of thinking, let me ask you, 200 years ago, would what we now call the extreme right wing been considered extreme right wing? I'm not sure they would have. I definitely would tell you that the far left 200 years ago, 300 years ago for sure. Let's go back to right before the American Revolution, that time period. The extreme left would today be considered very, very far to the right. So if the sweet spot is the best spot, and if the extreme left of yesteryear is the moderate to far right of today, then was the sweet spot 300 years ago, past fascism? Hopefully not. I mean, was that the right way to be? I don't think so. Most of us would think a lot of the people on what used to be called the extreme left, I think most of you who call yourself moderates would agree with them and say they were the good guys. So is it really worth putting everything on this line? What if we see the world more like the stars behind the line in that picture? A big three-dimensional picture, stars everywhere, all over. And your position might not be anywhere easily placed on a line. Try to get away from thinking about lines and think about something a little more meaty, like your position on what human freedom means. How does that connect to human equality? What do those words mean? How do we exemplify those characteristics in our social life? Are those characteristics we believe in exemplifying in our social life? What's the connection between freedom, equality, justice, and the good for human beings? Those are still fairly abstract questions, yes, but they're much more substantive than talking about lines. Don't paint people into boxes and corners by putting them on a line. Let's get past that metaphor. Okay, that's all I really have to say today.